From the heartland of America and the gateway to the West, good morning, good evening, wherever you may be across the nation, around the world. I'm George Norrie. This is Coast to Coast AM. Later tonight, Demons Among Us. Here's what's happening. Well, if you're looking for a mortgage, here's some news you can use. The Federal Reserve held interest rates steady for the second consecutive meeting, leaving the central bank's benchmark lending rate at its highest level still in 22 years. Economists and financial markets had expected the pause in the Fed's aggressive rate hiking campaign after several Fed officials signaled that they anticipate a further slowing of the U.S. economy. Here's investment analyst Mish Shedlock with us. Mish, did you expect this today?
I watched the statement said nothing, George. It was just like a repeat of last month, and there was no hawkish bias, at least that I saw. But one of the analysts I follow said that the Fed had a hawkish bias and was looking to tighten again. The Wall Street Journal made a similar comment. The Wall Street Journal headline was Fed extends rate hike but extends the hold but keeps hikes on the table. Okay. My take was that the Fed was going to pause for as long as it takes until they're right. Now, of course, the data, if it comes in differently than that, will cause them to hike or cut. So how do we determine which of those views is correct? There's a website, CME, that tracks how bettors are positioning, how they viewed the hike, how they viewed the Fed's discussion, and it looks more like my view was the correct one, that the Fed, although they kept saying that hikes are on the table, Powell also kept saying, at the same time, when pressed by the reporters whether or not they're going to cut or hike, he was very, very uncommittal. The market reaction was that the Fed is going to cut sooner now rather than later. I have the first rate cut coming in June of next year, based off of the market's reaction. And by December of next year, so looking ahead a full year, the market is now pricing in 4 rate cuts. I don't know if we see those, George, but that was the market's reaction. But there was also another piece of data that came out today that signaled the same thing. The ISM report was an absolute disaster. Manufacturing ISM plunged. All the categories are on hold. And I think the key thing there was something like 80% of the participants to this ISM study said that prices were actually falling. So I think the rate hike odds might have been a little influenced by that as well, but that's what we're looking at. The Fed is looking for the economy to weaken. We're seeing it today in the manufacturing report, so we'll see. But that would be my take, too. I think the Fed is probably going to cut quicker next year. I think the economy is going to slow much more than the analysts now believe.
So you don't anticipate a rate hike next month, for example?
I do not anticipate a rate hike next month. Neither does the market. The odds dropped. There is an 80% chance right now, up from 67%, of a hold in December. So that's what we're looking at. That would be my assessment as well. And I think as the data comes in, we're going to see that starts inching up towards 100%. We'll see. That's just my expectation based off of the data that comes in. Of course, we have the jobs report on Friday, and there will be another jobs report before the December meeting. So those are the key things that we need to follow. Is what does this jobs market say? Report this Friday and the first Friday in December.
Thanks, Mish. We'll talk to you next week. Terrorist threats against the United States reached a whole other level after the Hamas attack on Israel. According to the FBI Director Christopher Wray, he's telling Congress, saying the big players in terrorism have all renewed calls to attack America and its interests here as well. Howard Bloom's with us to take a look at the Israeli-Hamas conflict and what's happening. Hi, Howard.
Well, here's the latest. The most publicized news on the Hamas war in the last 3 days has been the opening of the Rafah crossing and the bombardments yesterday and today of Jabalia refugee camp, a modern Gazan city. In this pair of attacks, entire blocks have been flattened, a 20-story modern building was collapsed, and Hamas says that 195 people have been killed. But take a close look at the news footage. The area has not actually been flattened. At its center is a very, very deep crater. Why? Because the goal was to reach the tunnels under the city. Hamas has successfully focused media attention on the civilians killed, and those deaths are monstrous. But who has really killed these people? Hamas operates its military out of a spider web of 311 miles of tunnels, modern concrete tunnels wired for electricity, fully lit, partially air-conditioned, and with a communication system. Hamas has put its key centers in those tunnels under hospitals, mosques, and schools. It has also used these tunnels to hide its troops and to allow them to pop out behind Israeli lines in Gaza and even in Israel. In addition, it has stored large quantities of weapons above the tunnels in its chosen hospitals, mosques, and schools, even in United Nations facilities. Why? To ensure that if Israel attacks key Hamas military assets, it will have to get through a human shield of tens of thousands of civilians. In other words, Hamas has set up tens of thousands of civilians to die. And for Hamas, those deaths are victories. They fuel a publicity operation that is turning the world very successfully against Israel. Meanwhile, there are important things you are not being told. On October 24th, Hamas official Ghazi Hamad on Lebanon's LBCI News said, "We will repeat the October 7th attack time and again until Israel is annihilated." Meanwhile, the mainstream media has told us repeatedly that Israel is killing Palestinian patients in Gaza's hospitals by starving the hospitals of gas to power its generators. But earlier today, Israel's FBI, its Shin Bet, released a recording of a conversation in which the commander of the West Jabalia Brigade of Hamas speaks with the head of the Indonesian hospital in Gaza. Says the commander, "I'm here with Dr. Ataf on speaker. We went to fill up the diesel, the 1,000 liters that you talked about." So taking gasoline from hospitals and feeding it to Hamas military operations is apparently routine. And 43 minutes of new video footage has just come out, footage taken from Hamas attackers' body cams, from security cameras, and from dashboard cameras. It shows the atrocities of October 7th. For example, a father's eyes are gouged out. His wife's breasts are cut off. Their daughter has her legs lopped off. A baby is burned alive in an oven. Another baby is torn out of its mother's stomach. Meanwhile, Hamas is raining roughly 350 rockets a day on civilian targets in Israel, and two other groups are joining in, Hezbollah in Lebanon and the Houthis in Yemen. Hezbollah is firing as many as 30 anti-tank weapons and rockets a day at Israel. The Houthis have fired cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, and a flock of drones at Israel's civilian targets. Hezbollah and the Houthis have something in common. They are both proxy armies of Iran. In fact, Iran founded Hezbollah in Lebanon in 1982, and Iran has prepared this multi-front war with Israel for at least 10 years. In other words, for decades, Iran has wanted to obliterate Israel and to kill the world's Jews. But the mainstream media tells you very little about how the tunnels of Hamas are deliberately defended by the flesh and blood of Gaza's civilians. It does not tell you that up to 330,000 Israelis have been forced to flee their homes. It does not tell you that entire Israeli cities have been emptied, cities that border on Lebanon or Gaza. And the Western press is rapidly forgetting that Hamas started this war. In my opinion, a crime is being committed in our media. It is a crime against the truth.
Well said, Howard. Thank you. From Hollywood's death-dealing Terminator to warnings from the late genius Stephen Hawking or Silicon Valley stars, fears have been fueled that artificial intelligence could one day destroy humanity. Tech titans are racing toward creating an AI far smarter than people, pushing the U.S. to impose emergency regulations and the European Union seeking major legislation to be agreed on by the end of this year. A 2-day summit in London will explore regulatory safeguards against AI, such as those that we've been talking about. In a moment, Jeff Dunne joins us. Will AI turn into consciousness? That and much more next on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back to Coast. George Norrie with you. Dr. Jeffrey Dunne with us, president of the International Consciousness Research Laboratories, an organization established back in 1997 to continue the research of the effects of consciousness on physical systems, carried out at Princeton University from 1979 to 2007. His latest book is called Nexus. Jeff Dunne and on Coast to Coast. First-time guest, Jeff, welcome.
I am. Thank you, George. It's a pleasure to be here.
How did you get involved in consciousness studies?
Hereditarily, actually. My mother was one of the main research manager of the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Laboratory, and so I kind of grew up in that environment, and then over the years continued to grow in interest and experience with it, and then over the last decade or so became a more active researcher. You
got the bug and couldn't let it go, right?
Exactly.
You tell us more about the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research or Laboratory, or PEAR. Is that the one that so many people we've heard about have come from?
Could be, yeah. This was a research effort that was started, as you mentioned, back in the end of the 1970s, and what they set out to do is to take a different approach to understanding the effects of consciousness on other things, systems, especially physical systems. And what made it kind of unique was rather than trying to explore sort of gifted people doing amazing things, the research focused on regular people, everyday people who would come in and tried to have an influence on physical systems, whether in mechanical systems like balls dropping through a series of pins to influence them to go to the left or to the right, or digital systems. Think of it as an electronic coin flipper that was giving heads and tails. Could you make more heads and tails? And what was unique about the program was that they collected huge amounts of data to identify relatively small effects, but effects that were statistically significant. And after the course of some 30 years, they had collected such a huge body of data that it really became sort of this unquestionable body of evidence that there really was an effect here. Not a huge effect, but a statistically significant effect that you would have to essentially run the universe over a few times if this was to happen by chance.
Jeff, are you concerned that artificial intelligence is going to do away with humanity like some others are?
Good question. I don't think artificial intelligence is going to replace human intelligence, but I worry admittedly a little bit about the effect that artificial intelligence will have on us from a psychological and sociological perspective, because if you look at all cases in history where people have sort of stopped trying to use their minds to do things and relegated to devices, those capabilities atrophy. Same way that, for example, I used to be able to drive almost anywhere and know what direction was north, and now I use a GPS. I can't do any of that. So I do worry a bit about AI having this impact on us, but I think there are aspects of humanity that AI cannot replace. And the obvious one of it being relationships. We are a creature that is, sort of designed over the course of millennia through evolution to be social, and I don't think AI or any kind of computer is really going to be able to fulfill that need at the end of the day.
We're talking with Dr. Jeff Dunne. His book is called Nexus. We'll talk about that in a moment. What does consciousness mean to you, Doc?
Well, great question. Because that is different people have different answers to that question. Consciousness, when I talk about it, when I think about it, is sort of the ultimate expression of oneself. If you think about, the idea that you have thoughts and you can be aware that you have thoughts. What is it that is being aware that you've got thoughts going on in your head? That level of self that is sort of above those sort of typical things that you think of the things that you're doing, that's sort of the heart of what I consider to be consciousness, and that's ultimately what is the representation of self.
I don't think there's any way artificial intelligence can capture the consciousness of a human mind. Do you?
I don't. And in large part because people have done so many different studies and demonstrated in so many ways that the essence of what it is that we're doing as conscious beings is not a brain-induced phenomenon. Whether you're talking about people sitting on people watching themselves on an operating table because they've dissociated and observing things that happen while their brain activity has stopped. We talk about just a huge array of different experiences that people have that suggest that what the brain is more of a transducer or transmitter that connects something larger, consciousness, into the physical representation, right? And if that is the case, which, like I said, the evidence just is overwhelmingly that it is, then we're more than the physical matter. We go beyond that.
Well, I was going to say, can we really determine whether consciousness is tied directly to the brain, physical, as you mentioned, or outside of the brain?
There are a lot of cases where there are things that are happening that simply can't be explained by placing consciousness in the brain. For example, if you think about people who receive information that is simply not available to them through the eyes and the ears and so forth. There are channels that things are coming through, and like I said, experiences where people have sensory observations where the brain's not functioning. Suggests, I think, very, very strongly that we are definitely operating beyond the brain. The brain is certainly a piece of the overall puzzle, but it's not the central aspect of who and what we are. And as such, we've got to be beyond that.
It is dramatic, though, isn't it? Its abilities to do what it does.
The brain, you mean?
Yeah.
Well, it's hard to say if it's the brain that's doing it or sort of the consciousness that's doing it, and we are able to measure some aspect of that by looking at the brain, sort of like taking a picture of one side of something that's really amazing and not even appreciating necessarily that there's a lot more going on the other side.
But, of course, there are times when the brain gets damaged or injured, it screws up the person.
Yeah, well, it's certainly, if you look at that antenna metaphor, right, if that antenna gets damaged, it's not able to connect in the same way with whatever it was before, right? And so even if that consciousness is out there, its representation as it gets to the physical has been interfered with. It's corrupted in some sense. And as a result, the physical manifestation of that, the way that we see somebody, the way that we're able to interact, and all the rest of that is naturally going to be affected by that too. On the other hand, we're also very adaptable creatures. Lots of interesting examples of people who do have brain injuries and in time learn to sort of, if you call it this, reprogram themselves to work around the parts of the brain that aren't that have been damaged.
Jeff, what do you expect of the human brain in the next 20, 30 years? What do you think?
Well, we're going to evolve. There's no question that people are changing. It's certainly generation by generation as we experience different things in growing up, right from day one. That changes how brain development's going to happen. It changes, as I say, I think the brain is only one piece of the puzzle, changes how we as conscious beings evolve. So people who are growing up in a world where there is a lot of information, and the challenge is to identify out of that, to sift through that, to find the information that's relevant or hopefully accurate, that's a different growing up experience than somebody 100 years ago, where the problem was just getting any information at all. Right. And
I look at the growth of the brain, and let's use flight. Well, we're going to take a break, but let's think about this. Let's use flight as a brain, and look how it has evolved. and it continues to evolve. So we'll talk about that in a moment. Dr. Jeff Dunne with us. His book is called Nexus. We'll talk about that as well as we talk about the power of human consciousness, artificial intelligence, and, of course, next hour we'll take your calls with him. And welcome back to Coast. George Norrie with you, Dr. Jeff Dunne with us. Jeff, I wanted to cite flight as an example of the brain's progression, where we developed flight and then we ended up getting to the moon much longer later. Why did it take so long?
Why did it take so long for
the brain to develop to get to point A to B?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, you could have also asked the question, how did it happen so fast? It's hard to put a metric against how long it should take for these sorts of things to happen. There definitely is, as we get more complex, the rate at which we get more complex increases, right? Complexity sort of begets complexity, which is an interesting phenomenon if you think about it, given that at least, the predictions from sort of traditional physics, if you're familiar with entropy, say that we should all be becoming less complex, simpler systems, right? Things should be breaking down, and yet, obviously, when it comes to people, when it comes to life, we go in the opposite direction. Which, by the way, we mentioned briefly as syntropy is an explanation of that that there are ways of looking at this that explain why we're going to more complex systems as opposed to evolving into amoebas, for example.
Tell us about the book Nexus, which is a novel, isn't it?
It is. So Nexus was written for two purposes, really. Well, aside from, I guess I should say three purposes, because one of them is just to be an enjoyable read. But it comes about from two different angles, one of which is to share the idea about syntropy, which is a scientific principle that's not very well known. And there are other books about it. Lovely book, the one that I read that introduced me to the idea called Syntropy, the Spirit of Love. But they tend to be more technical. And Nexus was intended to share the basic ideas about it without being a science book, without being a text or a lecture. It was a story, but it weaves the ideas of this into the plot, so people can kind of get familiar with the idea of it without feeling like they're learning a science lesson. And then the other piece of it that really went into it was to paint kind of an optimistic picture that says, if we as a species can learn to get our arms around this idea of balance, not going from just this one extreme to the other extreme, this is bad and therefore we must go completely to the other end of it, what could the world look like if we could actually learn to recognize the value in differences that we have, right? Knowing that there's something of value in all of that. Not that we all have to be the same, but just taking a step towards respecting people who have a different way of looking at things.
And Jeff, explain syntropy for us.
Syntropy is, as a scientific principle, a complement to entropy. The same equations give rise to two different solutions, one of which is entropy, which describes a causal universe where energy propagates and information propagate forward in time, where systems become less structured, less ordered, more chaotic or random. And it does a pretty good job of explaining a lot of things, with the exception of life, as I mentioned before, where according to entropy, perhaps we should be evolving into amoebas, not the other way around. Syntropy, same equations, different another solution to it that describes a different way of looking at it. Instead of saying that or showing energy and information propagating forward in time, it says that energy and information are going to propagate backward in time. And if you follow that along, the conclusion of that is that as much as we live and experience things because of a causal universe, we also exist in a purpose-driven universe. That is to say, we do things towards a future purpose. And it's really much more of a bidirectional thing that's going on. And this is something that a lot of research now is showing to be the case, whether it's the pair research or even the implications of quantum mechanics and quantum entanglement and a million other things that are like that.
Jeff, what are the next steps of consciousness research? Where does it go?
Well, we have, I think, gotten to a point where the impact of consciousness is recognized, that it is more than just sort of a fluke or an illusion that we live in. This is a real thing that has real effects. And the challenge now is sort of twofold. One, it's very difficult for different people to work coherently on it because we all still have slightly different definitions of what consciousness is. That's not inherently a bad problem. That people having different ideas about what something is happens all over the place. But our language isn't really designed very well to let us recognize that we have slightly different understandings of these different ideas. So one direction that I think consciousness research is going to have to take is it's going to have to put some effort into getting people aligned in the way that we speak about things so that we know that we're on the same page. And then the next is to really recognize that the impacts of these things need to be recognized on a day-to-day basis. They shouldn't be conversations that happen in a research laboratory or a philosophy class or anything like that. They should be conversations that happen between any two people. My experience, when you're talking to somebody, chances are they've had some kind of experience that is connected to all of this, but they're hesitant to talk about it. And letting people know that it's okay to have those conversations is going to go a long way into helping us become more comfortable with it and then being more effective in doing the research itself.
How important is it doing the advancement in research? Are we way ahead of other countries in this area?
Good question. I don't know that we're significantly further ahead than other countries. Obviously, my organization is the International Consciousness Research Laboratories. So we have, in fact, probably more people in other countries that we work with than we do in the U.S. But I think, in general, countries are kind of at the same point in this. People are recognizing that there's more to us than materialism, and they're interested in figuring out how to make the world a better place by using that. And I think I would say that it's pretty well distributed around the world as far as I can tell.
What if this gets in the wrong hands, Jeff, this abilities to do consciousness research?
I don't know that is as much of a risk as it may worry people that it is. Let's put it that way. At the end of the day, consciousness research and the way that we work as people is most effective when people are establishing some kind of resonance with other people, resonance with whatever it is. And that kind of resonance is will inherently incline you towards positive relationships. It's very difficult to really feel like you're in resonance with somebody else, to be in that kind of connection and then say, you know what, I want to harm you. It's very difficult to do because you're really breaking down the barriers between yourself and that other, right? And in doing so, it's an unusual situation where you would say, well, now I feel closer to you and I want to cause some kind of hurt. So it's probably not certainly one of the less risky pursuits that one could do in science.
If the human brain were a machine or a computer, what would you say about how it was constructed? Magnificently? Average? What would it be?
Well, you've kind of set the premise of the question in opposition to the way that I think about it. So it's an interesting question to ask. If it were, the brain as an organ is like any other organ. In fact, the entirety of sort of the human structure is amazing. Its role in it, though, is often misinterpreted and as sort of like the main central core where all the thinking and the feeling and everything else takes place. And I think it is just one of a much larger system. And like I said earlier, that system is really, I think, not designed to do all the thinking and processing, but rather to enable us to connect to something that is much larger, that exists outside of the physical representation. And in that sense, it's pretty amazing.
Are you happy with the pace that we're doing artificial intelligence right now?
No. And by that I mean I actually think that we are, as we often do in science, going much faster because of what we can do than maybe we should in terms of recognizing the implications of what we are doing, right? And you could sort of go back through the course of history, and if people had taken a look at during the Industrial Revolution and what the implications of that might be for global warming or for the environment in general, would we have necessarily gone in the direction that we did at the rate that we did? And I think it's similar to in AI. We're doing a lot of really amazing things very, very fast without necessarily appreciating or thinking about what are the implications for what this will mean for us as a species, right? Is this actually in our best interest? Yes, AI can, for example, do things much faster than we can, but is doing things much faster really helpful in the long run? Certainly a lot of harm that can be done by doing things really, really fast and without necessarily understanding what one's doing.
If you could change the direction that we've been going in, what would you change?
In terms of AI, I think I certainly would put a much, not that we don't do ethical AI or consider ethical AI, because we do, and there is a lot of effort on that. But I would love to see us doing that in a much more pronounced way, and asking ourselves, what are the right tasks to apply artificial intelligence to versus what tasks can we apply artificial intelligence to? Because there absolutely are certain things where I think it can make huge strides forward in making life better for people. And if we were able to really focus it that way, we would be in a much better position. And in some sense, it's very much like the development of the Internet and people saying, you know what, if we had just thought about security at the beginning, maybe we wouldn't have had the problems that we have now. And similarly for AI, if we had thought about what it is that we really want out of it and should want out of it.
Where do you go next with the laboratory, Jeff? What happens?
For ICRL, our next steps are in many ways to continue what we're doing now. So we have sort of a threefold set of activities that we do, one of which is to continue the research from PAIR and to try to collect more data to understand better what the effects are and how to categorize the things that happen, because it's a very complex system. Inherently, it's subjective. It's tied to people, and that makes it very, very complex. So continuing the research is one. We have a variety of efforts that we're doing right now that look at that, that extend into healing and health and healing, and even other things that one doesn't normally think about in science, like art and other aspects like that. We obviously publish books as well to try to share information that's come before, and I think for us, the evolution of that is to put out more books like Nexus, where the goal is to try to make materials as accessible to as broad an audience as possible. And to continue the networking that we do in the sense of bringing people together to have conversations, to learn from one another. There's actually a tremendous number of organizations out there looking to do a lot of good, and we try to be part of that ecosystem that brings them together to kind of work in concert to be more effective as a set of organizations as opposed to individuals going off and doing their own thing.
With artificial intelligence, Jeff, what could go wrong?
Well, any time that you turn your thinking over to something else, you're in danger, right? And that's our biggest danger. I think that at some point you stop analyzing for yourself and you just take the word of the machine, and that's very worrisome for a variety of reasons. one of which is that the machines, and especially in today's state of AI, we are still training our AI systems based on the information that's out there, and there really is no way of knowing whether the information that's training it is accurate or biased. And so the answers that can come out can be very inaccurate or very biased. And when we stop thinking, if we just say, you hear the stories about people saying, "Oh, well, my boss just sent me a memo, and he or she had some large language model write the memo and didn't even bother to look at it to see whether it was relevant. It was just typed out." Like, there's a problem there, right? We've sort of lost connection with doing the things that we're supposed to be doing, and ultimately who's now responsible for the products that come out of that. And that's scary, because we will start to train ourselves to follow the machine instead of following human nature, which I think may have its own flaws, but at least has a basis for us in our experiences.
If the top of artificial intelligence was a 10, where would we be today? What number?
There's a lot of different ways of defining artificial intelligence. Probably, looking at it in the term of what they call generalized artificial intelligence. In other words, can I make a machine that can just do stuff the way that a person can do stuff? We are, I would say, a combination, and this is going to be an odd combination, of about 1 and 9. We have the appearance of 9 and the essence of a 1. What I mean. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
That's a big change.
Yeah, because what we're seeing, especially with large language models and so forth, is machines that are doing things that look really, really intelligent. They are able to harvest huge amounts of data to establish statistics that allow them, for example, to respond in ways that Alan Turing would have said, "Well, nope, I can't figure out the difference."
Big difference. Hold on, Jeff. We're at the top of the hour. We'll come back and chat more and open up the phone lines next.